Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. I'm now sitting in the chair as...
Thank you. I see that.
Yeah, Senator Grassley is going to...
You look good in that chair. You can get used to that.
It's a little higher seat, actually. Great testimony today. You pointed out that tax reform is working, and it certainly is. So is regulatory relief, I think, and some better trade agreements. And that combination is improving the lives of the people we represent, and it's good to see. When we started off in this effort, President Trump and the Congress said, okay, we're going to focus on tax reform because we believe that will result in more jobs, better wages, and leveling the playing field for U.S. companies that are trying to compete in the global economy. And all that's happened. And don't take my word for it. Here's the Congressional Budget Office. In April 2018, the nonpartisan CBO says in their analysis of the effects of tax reform, these changes are expected to encourage savings, investment, and work. CBO also estimated that the bill would reduce the incentives for companies to invest overseas by $65 billion per year. So in other words, encouraging investment right in the states that we represent. Together, these positive impacts on the economy, they said, would result in an average GDP increase by about 0.7%, and these CBO projections have held steady. In fact, just last week, CBO said, again, in a new blog post, the tax bill's effects on the economy have appeared consistent with our initial assessment. So that's CBO, but the numbers are clear. They're out there. Prior to tax reform, CBO said the economy would create an average of 107,000 jobs per month in 2018. We actually got an average of 193,000 jobs. They also said that in 2019 it would be 27,000 jobs per month. So far, we are 6 times ahead of that average at 175,000 jobs. So, you know, that's great. The thing that I like best is the wage growth. We've now seen for 18 straight months wage growth of over 3%. And as we know from the Bureau of Labor Statistics information, this is primarily helping folks who are non-supervisory, which means blue-collar workers, mid-income, low-income workers. And that's just awesome news. It's the longest period we've been able to see that kind of wage growth since before the Great Recession. So it's working. One thing that you will talk about a lot, I know today, is the international side. I've already heard you talk about it some. People are bringing money home. The old tax system encouraged those companies, as you know, to leave their income overseas, not to bring it back and pay our taxes. And the international provisions were designed to end that lockout, and that's exactly what's happened between January 2018 in September 2019, last data which we have, companies brought back over $1 trillion in overseas earnings, more than the previous 6 years combined. So those who say it hadn't made any difference, look at the numbers, which is why, by the way, on a bipartisan basis, we all agreed we had to do this change of lowering the rate and going to a territorial system. It's actually working. And tax revenues are up, not down, which is another thing that you've talked about a lot. I think you've done a very good job of trying to implement what was a complicated tax bill, let's face it, particularly on the international side. And I want to commend you for that. It's a difficult job, a whole new international tax system, again, one that was very bipartisan in its creation. Although at the end of the day, we didn't get a bipartisan vote, that part of the legislation was always something that we believed was a good idea on both sides of the aisle. In fact, Senator Schumer and I co-chaired the task force that came up with an international plan that was very much along the lines of what we ended up with. I think you've been unfairly criticized by some who have said by making the implementation changes that you are somehow not in keeping with the tax bill. I think it's just the opposite. And I must say that today I heard people pointing to the CBO baseline as a reason to say that, evidence of that. And I just say that's not how the regulatory and budget process works. Treasury does not score tax regulations. The same way it doesn't make a law. We make the laws, and the Joint Committee on Taxation scores tax legislation. And so your job is to implement the law in accordance with congressional intent, and I think you've done your best to do that. Second, the Joint Committee on Taxation is the one that, again, provides this, not the CBO. CBO may take into account some of the same assumptions made by joint tax, but they also incorporate hundreds, if not thousands, of other data points. So it's also important to note that CBO made both upward and downward revisions in terms of the overall forecast, and the critics only tell you about the downward revisions, which I think is interesting. So my sense is that the CBO downward revisions also come in large part because companies are actually paying more in Section 965 taxes, that's the repatriation taxes, in the first couple of years than they expected. And as a result, we gave companies 8 years to pay it. Companies paid it more quickly than that. So that's not a tax cut. Those are taxes already paid. On the GILTI, which was meant to be a guardrail in this new territorial system, I know that you have, again, come under some criticism on the way you have handled that. This is exactly what we intended, which was that we would have the ability to bring profits home, create that incentive, and trillions have come back, as we talked about. But at the same time, under GILTI, those companies who wanted to shift to low-tax jurisdictions would be penalized. And that's what you've done. The number we used for the minimum tax, in effect, was 13.125%. And the intent of the conference report was very, very clear on that. So critics continue to argue that your efforts to implement that intent provided new tax cuts. I would say not at all. Specifically, they're saying that your new proposed rule clarifies the connection between GILTI and the existing Subpart F rules, providing an exception for companies with foreign tax rates above 18.9% as a brand new tax break. That's ridiculous compared to our intent to exempt companies anywhere above 13.125%. I would say, if anything, your approach has been cautious, very conservative. So I wonder if you would give us your view on that. Do you believe you've taken a cautious and conservative approach to this in terms of the GILTI implementation based on the congressional intent, the taxpayer comments, and Treasury's regulatory authority?
Our job has been to implement that part of the tax code consistent with the intent and as prescribed by the law, and that's what we've done.
Excellent. Well, again, I commend you for that. I'm going to come back for a second round in a minute, give you more chance to talk about that and about what you've done to faithfully implement the tax legislation. Senator Warner.